Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Doug Rumminger, Executive Editor of Answers Magazine, and tonight I'm talking with Dr. Gregg Frazer of the Master's College. He is a professor of history and political studies at the Master's College, and he wrote an article in the most recent issue of Answers Magazine. Here's the issue, and his article was "The United States Really Founded as a Christian Nation?" Gregg has written a book called "The Religious Beliefs of America's Founders: Reason, Revelation, and Revolution." And on the basis of the research in that book, he wrote the article for us for the magazine. Gregg, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. I wanted to ask a little, right off the bat, about your background in history, and also reading the background of the research for your book and for this article. Could you tell us a little about what you studied and how you arrived at the conclusions you arrived at in your book?
Yeah, I have bachelor's, master's, and doctorates. My doctorate is from Claremont Graduate University here in California. I've been studying the religious beliefs of the founders in particular for some 30 years. Ultimately culminating in this book finally, after studying it for many years and threatening to write such a book. I finally did. And basically what motivated me to write the book and to deal with the issue is what I believe is a false dichotomy there concerning the question of America's founders and their religious beliefs. There's what I believe is, as I say, a false dichotomy that America's founders were either Christians or deists, or Christians or rank secularists, and I just didn't believe and don't believe that the evidence really backs up either claim, at least in terms of the key founders. One thing we should make clear to begin with: I don't think it's valid, generally speaking, to make general statements about the founders or the American founders and to say the founders believed this or the founders, because the founders were like politicians today. They were very diverse people who had different views, and they didn't collectively agree on almost anything, as we see in the Constitution, which is a collection of compromises. And so it's dangerous to say the founders said this or the founders believe that. And so I limit my claims to the key, what I call the key founders, the 8 most influential of the founders, at least I think they are. And so for them, for those 8, and for a number of others, I didn't believe that either of those 2 categories, Christian or deist or rank secularist, worked, and so that's what sort of motivated the writing of the book.
Okay, you sort of seem to equate, maybe not quite equate, but deist and rank secularist. What would be the difference between those two?
Well, deism was basically a religious belief system that was prevalent in Europe and had some impact in America in the 17th and 18th centuries. Today, it's applied in the sense of rank secularism, in the sense that the notion of a wall of separation between church and state, that the founders wanted to separate religion from public life and religion from government and so forth. And so the idea that they were deists or that they were rank secularists sort of fits in the same category in terms of this issue. That as it applied to America, to the Constitution, to public life, the idea that they were deists made them rank secularists who did not want any religious influence in public life, which I think is just on its face and clearly not true and not the case. Although people, when they hear that I argue that the American founders, as a rule, were not Christians, then they automatically assume that I say that they were deists or that they were secularists, and in fact I don't. I have another position. So.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get into that in just a minute because that's really the thrust of the article that we're discussing. How many? Well, first of all, how do you determine what a founder is? Or I mean, you're talking about the 8 most influential. We talk about the founders. Is there a set number?
No, there isn't. And who counts as a founding father is a really important question in this whole issue, in this whole debate. For some people, they more or less proceed along the notion that everybody who was alive at that time was a founding father. So if I can find a quote from somebody at that time, then this is what the founding fathers believe. And then there are those who have a very tight circle, very small circle of who counts as a founding father, and then there's a range in between. And there is no accepted definition or accepted sort of rope around a group of people to identify who's a founder, but basically there are those who want to have a very broad notion, and they include not only those who wrote the Constitution or wrote the Declaration of Independence and who were heavily involved in the Revolution or the early government, but they want to include a broader range of people, those who opposed the Constitution, those who were in the ratifying conventions for the Constitution, or anyone who was in Congress, in the first Congress, or in the Second Continental Congress, or the First Continental Congress. And then even others, such as pastors and ministers who weren't even involved politically, but were, I mean, directly politically, but who, for example, promoted the revolutionary cause and so forth. So that's sort of the broad circle. I tend to have a tighter circle, which some of my colleagues and friends don't. This is an area in which we disagree. Because I believe that just like you've probably experienced in any organization, if you have a meeting of 30 or 40 or 50 people, they're not all equally influential. There's always 3 or 4 sort of movers and shakers who sort of guide the discussion, control the agenda, put forward ideas, and then other people either agree or disagree. They jump on board or they oppose, but there are certain ones who are really driving the agenda and are more influential. And I argue that these 8 key founders that I identified were the movers and the shakers of the group. And in particular also, I focus on the founding documents. Who was most responsible for the content of the founding documents, because that's where the philosophy of the founding, that's where the ideas are found, is in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so that's where religious belief matters. What you believe religiously obviously affects your ideas, and where those ideas come into play is in the founding documents.
Okay, you mentioned documents.
Let me wait. Just I didn't clarify. I'm not saying that only these 8 are founding fathers. Okay, but I do have a somewhat tighter circle in some. I would say all those who were involved in the Constitutional Convention are founding fathers. Those who were part of the who are part of the drafting of the Declaration of Independence are founding fathers. And some of the political leaders of the founding era. So Thomas Jefferson, for example, wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, but he's still a founding father. He wrote the Declaration of Independence and so on. So I don't necessarily go along with the notion that everybody at ratifying conventions was a founding father, or the people who opposed the system were founding fathers. To me, that sort of runs counter to the notion of founding. Those who oppose the founding aren't really founders, as I see it. It's like people who you're trying to build a building and people are pulling away taking bricks away from you. They're not really contributing to the founding. So anyway, just to clarify a little bit.
Okay, thanks. Oh, before we go on further, I want to let viewers know that you can submit your questions for Dr. Frazer on the Google Hangout page just below the video, or you can also email them to authorchat@answersmagazine.com. Authorchat@answersmagazine.com. We'll be looking for those as well to bring into the conversation. So you mentioned I was gonna talk about documents. Before I get into documents, we started out talking about Christianity versus Deism / rank secularism, and you're saying that's a false dichotomy. So give us I guess it's the middle. What's your opinion of what the founders?
Yeah, I wrote the book to introduce a concept that I call theistic rationalism. Theistic rationalism. I believe that the 8 key founders were all theistic rationalists. And by the way, I do not deny that there were a number of Christians among the founding fathers. Okay, contrary to what some people take out of what my presentations, let me state up clearly, there were a number of Christians among the founding fathers. My argument is that the 8 key founders, the ones who were most influential, were not Christians, and that Christian principles, Christian thought, biblical principles, etc., did not play a very significant role in the founding. There were more Christians than there were deists, for sure. I think the left, the secular camp, is completely wrong in that regard. In fact, I could only, if I broadened the scope of what we just talked about as who counts as a founding father, I can only think of 2 deists. And you have to broaden the scope pretty widely to get to the second one. And so, contrary to what the secular left argues, there weren't very many, hardly any deists among the founding fathers. So that's not a significant camp. But nonetheless, it's the viewpoint that is presented in the academic community, generally speaking. So my concept that I introduce is theistic rationalists, which is something in between the two. Theistic rationalism was a sort of hybrid belief system combining elements of Christianity and natural religion, or deism. And I argue that these guys were raised in a generally Christian environment, a Christendom, as we might say, a general Christian milieu, and so they were familiar with the Bible, they were familiar with Christian ideas, etc. And then they were educated in Enlightenment thought, rationalism. And so then the influence of this rationalism that they were taught in their academic studies, their advanced studies, caused them to reject elements of Christianity that they thought were irrational and reject elements of deism or natural religion that they thought were irrational, and to construct something in the middle that borrowed some things from Christianity and some things from natural religion, but rejected whatever they considered to be irrational. So they basically determined their own belief system for themselves based on their own reason. And in particular, I should note, they rejected the deist notion of God, that God was an absentee God, the clockmaker God, the God who created everything and then took a vacation. They thought that was completely irrational, that a supreme being would create everything and create people, etc., and then have no interest in them and go off and do something else. The other key element of deism is the denial of any written revelation. Deists believed that the only revelation that God gave to man is through nature, and you can only see God in nature. And these theistic rationalists didn't believe that either. They thought that was irrational. They believed that there was some revelation from God, some written revelation from God. But where they differ from the Christians, they did not hold to a Christian view of God. In particular, they really didn't like the Old Testament God. They saw the Old Testament God as, capricious and arbitrary and mean and unfair and way too violent. And so they didn't like the Old Testament notion of God, and they didn't believe either that Jesus was God. And so they fundamentally reject the New Testament as well in that regard. And so they had their own view of God and the key word for them was beneficence, that God was kind, that God was beneficent, that God was good and cared for man to do him good, etc. And that was, of course, all by their own definition. We know that God is kind and beneficent, but they had their own definition as to what that meant. And so they sort of created a God that they were comfortable with, and that's the God then that they believed in. And that God did give some written revelation to man, but the way you determined what was written revelation from God was again by your own reason. Whatever seemed reasonable, whatever a God like that would write, or whatever a God like that would say, then they would accept that as written revelation from God. And so they rejected most of the Bible, especially the Old, as I said, the Old Testament. They rejected most of the Bible and accepted parts of the Bible as legitimately written revelation from God, which separates them again from the deists. Thomas Jefferson famously took a copy of the New Testament and a pair of scissors or a knife, depending on who you talk to, a straight edge, and cut out all the sections in the New Testament that were miracles or supernatural or anything that he thought was irrational, and then he pasted it back together and sort of created his own version of the Bible, which is still in print today. They call it now the Jefferson Bible. That's not what he called it. But that event represents what's going on in their thinking and in their mind.
Okay. This theistic rationalism sounds, maybe it's a little more rational than I'm thinking. It sounds an awful lot like modern cultural Christianity, where we have generally Christian principles and we believe in God, as a society. But when it comes down to, but God demands something of me, or calls something sin, well, then we start saying, well, no, I don't think God is like that.
Yes, absolutely. And in the last chapter of my book, I talk about long-term effects of theistic rationalism, and that's one of the things that I talk about. That this notion of theistic rationalism left a legacy in our civil religion and in other ways as well in terms of religion. And so anytime you see people who claim to be Christians who, when push comes to shove and God makes some kind of demand on them that they don't like, and they say, well, God wouldn't do that, or the God that I know or the God that I love wouldn't do that, that's I think, a leftover in a sense, a descending down from theistic rationalism, that you create God essentially in your own image, and whatever you want him to demand of you, then that's what you pay attention to.
Okay. We have a specific question about Ben Franklin. I'll just throw that in. This person says that having read his autobiography years ago and other public statements, I've always thought that he came back to the Christianity of his youth in later life. Why would you differ on that?
Well, yeah, the case of Benjamin Franklin is very interesting because he's, of course, universally called a deist by almost everyone in both sides of the debate, but certainly in the secular community. And that's largely based on the fact that when he was a young man, about 17 years old, he became a deist and writes about it in his autobiography. But what they somehow miss is just about 3 pages later in the autobiography, he talks about how he became less enchanted with deism and decided that it didn't work. And he actually wrote an essay called On the Providence of God, in which he investigated 4 different views of the providence of God And in that essay, he rejected the deist view as irrational. And so he, as a young man, he was a deist, but he changed and fairly early, and ultimately rejected deism and came to a different conclusion. Coming back to the Christianity of his youth, I don't know that there was a Christianity of his youth. I don't see that reflected in Franklin at all. And his notion of God that he lays out rather clearly, especially in, he wrote daily devotions. He wrote a sort of his own daily devotion book. And if you read through that, you can see very clearly that his notion of God is not at all the Christian, God. And he never identified with Christ at all. Near the end of his life, he was asked by a minister specifically about his views of Jesus. And at that point, he wrote to the minister and said, as to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, he said, I have some doubts as to his divinity. Now, in the 18th century, this is one of the things people need to understand is language and idioms and usages in different centuries. In the 18th century in America, when someone was talking to someone that they respected and whose opinion they cared about and someone that they were friends with, if you disagreed with them, then you would say, I have doubts about that. You wouldn't say you were an idiot, like people would say today, or boy, that was really stupid, or something like that. You would say politely, I have doubts, as when you know that someone holds a particular view. So when he says, I have doubts as to his divinity, he doesn't mean that he's in doubt about it. He means that he disagrees. And in fact, he follows it up by saying, he says, but I'm not dogmatic about it, having never studied it. So he says, I've never really thought too much about it. He hasn't really considered it. And then he says, and this is the saddest thing I discovered in 30 years of study, the saddest statement. He said, and I think it's unwise to busy myself with it now when I expect soon to find out the truth with less trouble. In other words, he knew he was going to die before long, and he would find out the truth of whether Jesus was God or not. And of course, unfortunately, he did find out.
Yeah. I was wondering whether you were going to mention that, because I vaguely remembered reading that. I couldn't remember exactly what he had said, but something about that idea. I'm not really sure, but I'll find out pretty soon, so I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, and he was actually close friends with George Whitefield, the famous the famous English evangelist who traveled through America. Whitefield stayed at his home and so forth. They were good friends. He liked Whitefield. He liked listening to him preach, but he also said specifically that Whitefield prayed for his salvation daily and never got the satisfaction of believing that his prayers were answered. And so Franklin is saying there that Whitefield obviously was praying for his salvation, but that he never accepted Christ. So
yeah.
I think there are a lot of other things as well. There's plenty of evidence to indicate that Franklin was not a Christian. But where my book is different than most books is I also argue he was not a deist, which is sort of the universal thing, and I argue that he in fact was a theistic rationalist.
You're talking about Franklin's autobiography and so on, leads to a question about, you mentioned the ideas of the founders show up in the documents that they produce. Specifically, you're speaking at that point of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So you see how these ideas of the founders work out in those documents. How do you know what to trust when you go looking deeper for what each individual actually believes? We've got political speeches. Interestingly enough, we generally do not trust the political speech today. We've got political statements. We've got personal writings. We've got, actually, I'm not even sure what all the different varieties of documents are. So how do you choose? How do you figure out which ones are worth should be taken as what they actually thought, and which ones trying to convince somebody of something else?
That's an excellent question and a very important question, and I apologize because I'm about to sound elitist, but this is a reason that historians, that there's a difference between the work of a historian, a trained historian, and just somebody who picks up a document and looks at it. We're trained to evaluate sources. We're trained to bring a skeptical or questioning attitude to sources, and to try and look for reasons why, to not accept necessarily at face value what everybody says in every case, in every instance, in every context. For example, public documents, public proclamations. Not all, politicians, as we well know, don't always say exactly what they think in public proclamations and so forth. They're politicians, and they know how to make the people happy and to say what the people want to hear. And so you have to take public documents and public proclamations and things that are passed by Congress and so on with a certain grain of salt. This is how you don't dismiss them completely, but you shouldn't rely too much upon them. And if somebody says something there that they say something different in private, then I think you need to give a lot more credibility to what's said in private, where they don't think anybody else is going to see it, and therefore they don't have a motive to say something other than they really believe. So what I focused on in my research, obviously I looked at public documents as well, but I focused on private correspondence, letters, diary entries, personal memoranda of the key founders rather than public pronouncements. And this is an assumption on my part, and everybody makes an assumption when they deal with evidence. My assumption is that individuals are most open and honest concerning their true beliefs when they're speaking privately in writings that they don't think will be seen by the public. Rather than they know, as I said, they know as public figures how to appeal to the public and say what the public wants to hear, but there's no need to do that in private writings. There they can be free and candid and transparent. In fact, in a number of cases, some of the key founders, when they were writing to someone about their religious beliefs, actually at the end of the letter would say, when you finish reading this, burn it, destroy it, or send it back to me. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson actually went to the widow of one of his correspondents to collect his letters back, so that they wouldn't get out into the public's hands, because they understood that what they were saying was not what the public wanted to hear, the more conventionally religious public. And so at times they were very careful about that. Jefferson printed one publication that was very controversial, and so he published it over in Europe, so that it wouldn't be seen by most Americans. And so they were very conscious about this. So while I looked at everything, I focused attention particularly on what they wrote in private, in things that they didn't think would be for public perusal. Just like politicians today, when these emails are revealed, right? You have the public statements by politicians and so on, and then all of a sudden something happens, their emails get subpoenaed, and what do we find? We find what they really were saying or what they were really thinking. And so that's what I predominantly focused on.
Okay, here's a question about the meaning of Christianity in the writings of the Founding Fathers. Would you say the majority of the Founding Fathers held a functional view of religion? In other words, the purpose of Christianity was to form a civic belief system?
Yeah, and it's important. That's a good question because it brings up the issue of what's Christianity. I didn't impose my own view of Christianity on the book or in the book. What I did was look at the creeds and confessions and catechisms of the major Christian denominations in 18th century America at that time. What did the churches at that time identify as the fundamental core foundational beliefs that comprise Christianity, that someone would have to hold in order to be considered a Christian. And from those, I put together a list of 10 fundamental core doctrines that all of the significant denominations of Christians in 18th century America held to be fundamental beliefs. A list of 10 that all of them agreed upon, and then I used that as the basis for making the evaluation. Did these guys believe in these 10 things, or how many of them? And in general, the theistic rationalists believed in only one of the 10 fundamental doctrines. Some of them believed in one or two others, but for the most part, they only believed in one of the 10. And then the other part of the question, the purpose of Christianity, the purpose of religion for these guys was in fact functional. They believed that they were creating a free society. And when you have a free society and you allow people freedom to do what they want, the question is, how do you get them to behave? If you don't have the iron fist, if you don't have the whip, if you don't have the punishment hanging over their heads, you're going to give them freedom to do what they want, then how do you get them to behave? And their answer was morality. The way to get people to behave in a free society was to make them moral. How do you get morality? Religion. So that was the purpose and the primary, that was the purpose of religion, and the real value of religion in their minds was to make people moral so that they would behave in a free society, so that we could afford, if you will, to have a free society. And so this is why they believe, contrary to what the secularists argue today, and this is again where the left is wrong, they believe that it was very important to have religion in the public square, very important to have religion in public life, not just behind doors or inside of churches, but in public life, because it produced this morality, this public virtue that was necessary in order to allow a free society to work. So this notion of a wall of separation between church and state and removing religion from public life is completely foreign to the founders. Here's where I agree completely with those on sort of the Christian right who argue for a Christian America. There's where we both agree that they did not want to have a wall of separation. They didn't create one. They didn't want one. They wanted religious influence in the public square. It's just the difference between us is that I argue it didn't have to be Christianity. They wanted religion. And all of the religions that they were familiar with in their day promoted morality, and for them, any and all religions were as good as any other for that purpose. And so it wasn't specifically designed to favor Christianity or to promote Christianity, but simply to favor and promote religion.
Okay, and following up on that, what was in the seminary in the colony time? How did that influence the preaching from the pulpit?
Yeah, this is another very important thing. Those who argue for the Christian America position point out that ministers, clergymen, pastors were very involved in promoting, for example, the American Revolution. And they were. The pulpits were major recruiters for the American Revolution and played a key role. And so some argue then, well, the pastors were heavily involved and they did this, that, and the other, therefore it's Christian. Well, that only is the case if the pastors are Christian and if they are promoting the Bible and teaching Christianity. And in fact, in the pre-revolutionary period and after, there were a number of ministers, a number of pastors who, in fact, I would argue, were not Christians. They didn't hold to these 10 essential Christian beliefs that I'm talking about. In fact, they didn't believe the gospel. Most people don't know that Yale University was actually started because of all the complaints that congregations were giving for the ministers that they were getting out of Harvard. that, as they put it, that they don't know the gospel, and they don't preach the Bible. And so this is another thing that's sort of different in my book, is I connect the political leaders with the religious leaders because they both got the same kind of education. And so there was a big gap between the educated elite and the common people, so to speak. The educated elite were taught Enlightenment rationalism at the universities. And there were no seminaries per se. There were colleges, or they were all seminaries. This is another thing. They were all called seminaries. And so when someone says X number of founders were seminary graduates, and that implies that they studied theology, they could have studied business or agriculture at the seminaries. It wasn't like we call them today. They were all called seminaries. But anyway, the seminaries or colleges taught Enlightenment rationalism, particularly at Harvard, and then eventually at Yale. Just a few years after Yale has started to try and fix that problem, they succumbed to the same thing. And so ministers were coming out of Harvard and Yale teaching Enlightenment rationalist thought, not teaching the Bible, not teaching the gospel, not teaching Christianity in many cases, or if they were using the Bible, they were using it but not teaching it. They were using it in order to support whatever ideas they were bringing to the table, but not teaching from the Bible per se. And so that's another very important factor during this whole period, is that a number of ministers, obviously not all of them, but a number of ministers, in fact, you would read the sermons and they would quote the celebrated Mr. Locke, which is John Locke, the Enlightenment philosopher. And in a number of cases, he's cited as much or more than the Bible by the ministers. And so, yeah, so that's an important question. A number of the ministers were teaching something other than Christianity to their congregants, which, by the way, reinforced what they were getting elsewhere and made it that much more effective. Wherever they went for information, whether it was a newspaper or whether it was the town square or it was the pulpit, they were getting the same type of information.
Okay, I have a question here that's probably going to need some explanation because it's actually something I'm not real familiar with. But he was asking, I'm confused about the difference between Witherspoon's teaching in the classroom versus preaching in the pulpit. Does he make any strong statements about gospel definition rather than just Christian morality in his writing? Can you educate me on?
Okay, I didn't catch the whole thing. You're talking about Witherspoon?
Witherspoon, yes. The difference between
okay.
Classroom and preaching.
It was a common practice at the time for presidents to teach one class. And the standard class that they taught was moral philosophy. And that's what Witherspoon taught at what became Princeton. He taught moral philosophy. And I've actually read his class notes of what he taught in his moral philosophy class. And it's very interesting because at the beginning, Witherspoon says, I could read you the direct quote if I could find it. I'll see if I can find it while I'm talking. But Witherspoon says, as he's starting to teach this class, oh wait, it's up here in the front. He says, let me find it. Basically, he says that we're going to proceed. We're going to proceed on the basis. Here we go. He began his lectures by describing moral philosophy this way, quote, an inquiry into the nature and grounds of moral obligation by reason as distinct from revelation. And so he makes a distinction in his class between what you can learn from reason and what you can learn from revelation. And then he said, there are but two ways in which we come to the knowledge of things. First, sensation, and second, reflection. And so he begins the class by saying we're going to do things on the basis of reason. And then I go through and list a number of examples where he talks about this, and and how these principles are gleaned by reason. So even though he was a pastor, when he was teaching this class, the one that is so formative, you know, people talk about the idea that Witherspoon taught all of these founders, and he did teach a large number of founders and had a great influence on them. But the question is, what influence did he have on them? The fact that he was a Christian doesn't automatically mean that he had a Christian influence on them. It depends on what he's teaching. Same thing with the pastors. The fact that they're pastors in a church doesn't automatically mean that what people glean from them is Christianity or the gospel. They glean from them whatever they taught. And in the case of Witherspoon, he taught moral philosophy from the basis of reason rather than revelation, which is curious because before he came to America to take over at Princeton, Witherspoon was in Scotland and he fought against the rationalists. And upheld the faith. And so when people, by the way, quote Witherspoon in order to sort of defend the idea that he taught Christianity, they invariably quote from things that he said in Scotland in his messages and so forth, not what he actually taught in America, which is very different. And this is, by the way, one of the interesting conundrums is why did Witherspoon change and teach this way in this one class? And I'm not saying he lost his Christianity. I don't believe anybody can lose their Christianity. He was still a Christian, but in terms of what he was teaching in the class, it wasn't Christianity, it was reason.
Okay, I want to go into, I guess, the last third of the hour. Before we get to the end, I want to address this is a sensitive issue with a lot of people. I know I grew up with a pretty much Christian America view. I kind of started to see the problems, at least with equating my brand of politics with Christ's words. You know, the one should be derived from the other, but they're not the same thing. So then, as I started coming to the conclusion that okay, the founders weren't all Christians. I was in a military class just a couple of months ago. We talked about Andrew Jackson. We studied one of his battles, where he and the agreements he made with the Creeks and the Cherokees. Then he became president, and he sent the Cherokees down the Trail of Tears. We have a history of violating treaties, which is obviously not a Christian thing. So the question becomes, how does this affect my loyalty to my country, my patriotism? Does it somehow make it impossible for me to celebrate July 4th, for example, because America was not founded by people who actually were overtly Christian? And a parallel to that is, what about the poor Germans and Frenchmen who didn't even have, didn't have a Christian basis in their founding at all? So what is a good Christian perspective on patriotism, on civic responsibility, civic duty, and I'll use the bad word, civic pride.
Yeah, this is a good point. This is a good point in our discussion for me to clarify, to make sure that everybody understands that I'm not anti-American. I feel exceedingly blessed and thankful to God that He placed me in the United States of America. I wouldn't want to live in any other country. I think the United States is the greatest country in the history of the world, and I think the American political system is the best ever devised by man in history. It's not perfect because it was devised by man, so it's flawed, but nonetheless, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else, so I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression that I'm trying to rip on America or drive down America or something like that. That far be it from that. But I don't understand why someone can't be thankful to God for placing them in America and making them Americans, being part of a country that I would argue has been one of the greatest, if not the greatest, forces for good in the history of the world. Why they can't be thankful for that unless the founders intended to create a Christian nation. I just don't understand that. Can you not be thankful for the automobile you have unless the person who created it's a Christian? Can you not be thankful for the computer that you're following along with in this, or the radio, or etc., unless you find out that the people who created them are Christians? God uses nations for His purposes. He uses good nations and bad nations. He uses righteous nations and sinning nations. Some people think that a nation has to, and some teach, that a nation has to be righteous in order for God to do anything good with it. Well, that's simply not the history of the Bible or the history of the world. God uses nations to accomplish His purposes. And He uses people who are righteous, and He uses people who are sinners. And whether the United States was intended to be a Christian nation by its founders or not, I don't think should have anything to do with whether we're thankful to God for the United States of America. In terms of patriotism, the Bible doesn't instruct us to be patriotic, and it doesn't say it's wrong or bad to be patriotic. The Bible just doesn't address the issue of patriotism. I think we're free to be patriotic if we want to, as long as we keep it within bounds. You know, patriotism is fundamentally love for or devotion to one's country, and I think that's perfectly fine as long as it's within limits, as long as it doesn't rival our love for God, as long as we don't place our hope in the country or in political processes instead of in God. And I think this is one of the dangers of going too far in the sort of Christian America direction, is that people then start to place their hope and their trust and their faith in institutions that they think are biblical or Christian, or in the notion that if we could just elect the right president, then all of our woes would go away and America could be moral again. Or if we just get one more Supreme Court justice, then we can solve everything. And you know, America's problems aren't based on the idea that there are sinners in offices of power, because every government in every country has always had sinners in offices of power. We're all sinners. America's problem is centered in John 3:19, is that people are sinners and they love the darkness rather than the light. And that's why there are problems and moral decline and so forth in America, not because of some political makeup of the Congress or the presidency or the Supreme Court. Not to say that those things aren't important. It's just ultimately our hope needs to be in God. Our trust needs to be in God. And whether the founders intended to create a Christian nation or not really doesn't have much to do with that. If you want to be patriotic, if you want to love your country in a restrained fashion, if you want to celebrate the 4th of July, you know, some people, I guess, in reading my article, thought that I was trying to discourage them from participating in 4th of July celebrations. I don't understand how you would get that out of the article. I never addressed the issue at all. But there's certainly nothing wrong with participating in 4th of July celebrations, or you know, singing the songs, or waving the flag, or waving sparklers, or whatever. And I just don't see a necessary connection between whether the founders intended to create or created a Christian nation and that idea. The Bible teaches us to be subject to authority and to be obedient to authority. That's what God teaches us about government, and we can do that either way. And if you want to go farther and to be patriotic, you know, there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's within certain bounds, and there's nothing that keeps you from doing that, whether the founders intended to create a Christian nation or not, at least as I see it.
So this may be kind of a corollary to that. So what is the importance of what the founders intended? I mean, I think a lot of Christians on either side of this question would agree that America today is not the America the founders intended, in some ways or others. So given that it's not what they intended, what is the importance of knowing what they really did intend? I guess I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, there's I think several reasons that it's important. But fundamentally, it's to understand those founding documents and what America is all about. For example, I mentioned that people on the left and the right base their views and assumptions concerning the founding on, or base their views and assumptions for what they want to happen in America, what they want to do in America on the founding. They both claim a heritage from the founding for what they want to do, and as I said, I believe they're both wrong, and so neither of them has a foundation for the founding. But it's important because on the left, for example, they want to do this wall of separation notion, which I would argue has resulted in the loss of religious liberty, and is going to continue to result in loss of religious liberty. We've had a couple of court decisions recently that's going to only accelerate the loss of religious liberty. And that's largely based on a faulty view of what they believe that the founders wanted to accomplish here. And so it's important to know that that's not what the founders wanted to accomplish here. On the other side, believing that the founders intended to create a Christian nation and that our systems were designed on biblical principles, for which, by the way, there's no evidence. If you read the notes of the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist Papers and even the ratifying conventions, but be that as it may, the idea that our systems and our parts of our government and our principles were biblical, I think causes one to too closely wed Americanism and Christianity, and I think it creates a potentially dangerous situation where people can't distinguish between their Christianity and their Americanism, and it also leads, as I said, to a sort of false trust or hope in systems and processes rather than in God. And then there's a number of other reasons that I think it's important. The Bible becomes merely a tool of a political agenda rather than the Word of God. And there's a number of other reasons why I think it's significant. In fact, I've got a list of 12 reasons that I think this matters, that this is important. But fundamentally, it's important because it affects the way people act today. What they believe about the founders and what they were trying to accomplish affects what they do today, both on the right and on the left, and I think in negative ways. And a more accurate and balanced, frankly, understanding of what the framers were trying to accomplish, I think, allows us a more balanced perspective in going forward today.
Okay, thanks. I keep thinking. I grew up during the Reagan Revolution. My father was very active in politics in South Carolina at that time, and there was a lot of hope among Christians that, okay, we got a president who agrees with us, and things are looking up. And it was years later, 10 or 15 years later, that I began to see books in bookstores basically pointing to conservative politics that Christians were using and being harsh in, and saying this is why people don't want to listen to Christians anymore, something along that. In other words, equating those conservative politics with Christianity, which I think at some point we ourselves did. So it's been helpful to me to remember that my citizenship is in heaven, and my King tells me to obey the powers here that he put in charge of me.
Amen. Our citizenship is in heaven, and so I think that's a good lesson that you learned through the years. And as you said, sometimes people who personally, I liked Ronald Reagan. I thought he was an excellent president, one of the better presidents in American history. But frankly, he didn't do much for the causes that most motivate the Christian community. He didn't do much about abortion, for example. And so this is, again, the problem with believing that if we just elect the right person, you had Ronald Reagan as president for 8 years, and what do you have to show for it in terms of things that really matter to Christians specifically? You may have had some more conservative things concerning tax levels and military spending and those kinds of things, but those aren't fundamentally Christian issues. Those aren't social issues. Those aren't moral issues. And so this is part of the problem of, again, putting our hope or our trust in men rather than in God, in men or in processes, in systems, rather than fundamentally in God. There's only so much that men and processes and systems can do.
And we have like about 5 minutes left. I wanted to mention, you may have mentioned this already, but something you mentioned in the article too, that often the quotations that we like to grab are theistic, but not necessarily Christian. I think you mentioned if we go with what a politician says about his beliefs, then the past 7 or 8 presidents were all Christians based on church attendance and singing Amazing Grace at funerals or whatever. So, so if we're going on the basis of those statements, what are we complaining about?
Right, and one of the evidences that's put forward concerning the founders being Christians is that 50 or 52 of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, it's argued, were Orthodox Christians because they were affiliated with denominations, Christian denominations, Protestant, or in the case of 2 of them, Catholic denominations. And the only evidence for that claim is the table of contents of a book. Just the table of contents, where the author lists the 55 guys and then lists their denominational affiliation. And then and then the book it's M.E. Bradford's A Worthy Company. I lost it there for a second. M.E. Bradford's A Worthy Company, he has brief biographies of the 55 convention delegates, and in the table of contents he lists their denominational affiliation, and then he has brief biographies of them, and only about 5 of those 55 is there much mention of religion or their faith or Christianity. The rest of it's just all about their education and what offices they held in their lives and so on and so forth. There's no evidence to support that their denominational affiliation was anything other than just a club membership, like it is for many people today. And if that's the basis, if just denominational affiliation is the basis for making someone a Christian, well then 86% of Congress today fits that bill. And so do all the presidents. And so what's the problem? Why are people upset? If that's the standard, for determining whether someone's a Christian or not, then we've got no problem. 86% of Congress today is Christian too.
Yeah, and I'd like to finish on a little bit of an upbeat note, if we can, because I felt myself here kind of like I might be bashing the founding fathers here unintentionally. I want to reiterate something you said earlier and ask you to comment on it briefly, and that is the idea that just because they weren't saved men doesn't mean that God didn't use them for good, and I would even go so far as saying something it doesn't mean they weren't great men, and good insofar as sinners can be good. Would you mind closing with a comment on that?
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that. I am a huge fan of the founders. I mean, not all of them, but a goodly portion of them. I'm always defending them, actually, with more secular colleagues and so forth at various places. I personally, for example, I'm a list person. Okay, I'm a sucker for lists, And in my list of the 10 greatest Americans, George Washington is numbers 1 through 5. George Washington, I think, is far and away the greatest American. I don't believe he was a believer. I don't believe he accepted Christ as a savior. He wasn't a Christian, but he was a great man who was greatly used. And so I have great respect for most of the founding fathers, and for what they did and what they accomplished. And as you said, I think that God had greatly used them to create a great nation and a great political system. And they don't have to be born-again Christians in order for God to do that through them.
Well, thank you. I think on that note, our time has run out. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And it's been educational and a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.